Hello there, welcome. My name is Alicia Harris, and this is my podcast review for MIT 3222B. Today, I'm going to be taking a look at three vastly different podcasts in terms of content, style, and genre. So first, I'll be looking at Unsolved Murders with Carter Roy and Wendy Mackenzie. Second, Cody Ko's Insanely Chill podcast. And finally, Ben Miller on the search for alien life. I'm going to be talking about the entertainment value of each podcast. So for that, I'm going to be sticking to a little rubric just to frame my thinking for what makes a podcast entertaining, what makes it stick or get the reaction that it's going for. So I'm going to break it down into four categories of entertainment value. The first is structure. So that is, does it make sense? Does it have a beginning, middle, and end to keep you hooked? And if it doesn't have no apparent beginning, middle, and end, why is that? Is it easy to listen to or understand? The second category I'm going to be looking at is the successful appeal to emotion. So is it evoking the proper emotions that it's trying to invoke in you? So for example, if it's a comedy, is it funny? Does it make you laugh? If it's horror or suspense, does it scare you or keep you on edge? So basically, does it evoke the emotions that it's trying to? Third, the content. So is the subject or the subjects discussed intriguing? Is it original? What do they talk about? And is it relevant to the podcast title or genre that made you click it in the first place? And the fourth and final category is the design and the details. So is it designed in such a way that keeps your interest? Is there background music or dialogue? Why is it there or why is it not there? Does it do what it's supposed to do? And basically, what details are in the podcast that make it entertaining? So this is just a rubric. It's just a framework. I'm going to disclose any subjectivities, and I won't be scoring or quantifying any of the podcasts. So I'm just going to sit there and talk about how I see the entertainment value come out in each podcast according to this framework. The first podcast that I'll be reviewing is Unsolved Murder, The Boy in the Box, and this is with Carter Roy and Wendy Mackenzie. So this podcast is described as a drama with a modern twist on old-time radio that delves into the mystery of true cold cases and unsolved murders. With the help of an ensemble cast, follow our host as they take you on an entertaining journey through the crime scene, the investigation, and the attempt to solve the case. So clearly, this podcast is inspired by old-time radio, which leads me to believe that it will be more like the radio shows we've listened to the first week of this class, such as Annie and A Date with Judy, that carry a storyline and attempt to create scenes and visuals in our mind through sound. So this specific episode is about a young child who was found in a JCPenney box on the side of a road, which to start off is a very eerie subject. There's a disclaimer at the beginning that sets the mood right off the bat. It says it's not for children or the lighthearted. Right off the bat, we understand that it's a suspenseful drama style. It's investigative. It's a crime. It's suspense, even thriller. And this disclaimer really sets the mood. So first, I'm going to go into structure. So the structure style has a story beginning, middle, and end. So it's a storyline because it has two depths. It's got the narrative where the two hosts are speaking, and then it's got the second level of storytelling details coming to life. So there are different voices that take on different characters in order to portray the facts of the crime, which is nice because it goes back to the idea of storytelling on old-time radio, so you can really see the inspiration here. This podcast also took on the structure of a question and answer, where Wendy would ask, for example, so is the person to find the body didn't even call the cops? And then Carter would answer the questions with details of the case. So this dialogue was extremely cheesy and staged, but it was effective. Because when investigating a crime, there are so many questions and so many details that the audience wants to know. So the back and forth really works for this podcast because it reflects the nature of a podcast, which is an investigation. So the breaking down of theories is an effective structure. It opens up a lot of questions, but also gets to the evidence. I found, however, that the back and forth style also leaves little room for the audience to kind of think about their own opinions or ideas because it answers the questions before we can even think of them. I'm going to delve in a little bit more into design, detail, and the appeal to emotion. So this podcast had a lot of music, musical cues, a lot of sound cues. There was a lot of sound effects. Specifically, the music was very deep and dark. It was suspenseful. It was very effective in setting the mood. When discovering the boy in the box, it really caught your attention. There was loud music. It kind of scared me. It leaves you wanting to know more. So the changes of voices and the taking on of characters with the narration, the dramatization was very effective. You could tell when the narrators were talking about the details of the case, and you could tell when the actors were acting. And the sound effects were very effective. So the sounds of the cameras, the pen scratching, the footsteps just added that extra level of visuals almost, even though you can't see. It helps create the image in your head. There's heavy, dark piano at really scary parts. So I think the design and the detail really helped with the appeal to emotion to scare you and create suspense. One negative thing about the design, I would say, is kind of how structured it was. It seems very staged, which is just a personal thing. I don't like things that seem unnatural or staged. Like, for example, she would go, "Oh, no way, he didn't report it." And I was like, oh, this is so cliche. This is so cheesy, so staged. So that's just a personal thing about the design. I think the importance in the design all goes back to their background music and their sound effects. So the content for this podcast was really interesting. It's factual and at the same time really appeals well to our curiosity. It built my suspense really well. I do, however, believe that the content in itself is intrinsically interesting. I think just the topic they're talking about is supposed to be interesting. That's what really makes people click on it. Their execution was also done very well. So they took a very interesting subject and they executed it well to explain it and keep our attention. So it's not necessarily original content because the story has been told many times. The first time I actually heard this story was by BuzzFeed. They have an unsolved crime series. But overall, it was effective and entertaining, suspenseful. It was also very high quality. You could tell they put a lot of hard work into this. It kept my interest. But I personally just found it a little bit too structured and unnatural. They did do a good job based on my rubric, though, when it comes to entertainment value. The next podcast that I'm going to be looking at is Insanely Chill by Cody Ko. So it's described as comedian and YouTuber Cody Ko talks to himself about pressing issues. And I think this is kind of a sarcastic idea that he's talking about pressing issues because it is quite literally Cody sitting down with a microphone and talking about nothing. Very random issues, nothing that really sticks out. It's not obviously he's not talking about current events or anything political or anything that's actually a relevant pressing issue. He's just talking about little niche things that piss him off. So why do people stop in dumb places? In order to understand this podcast, you have to understand a little bit more about Cody Ko as a person. He started off on Vine, which is where he found his fame. Then he started moving towards vlogging. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that he is a vlogger because it says a lot about the style of the podcast, the structure, and why so many people follow it. It's actually a huge popular podcast on YouTube specifically, but also on his podcast channel through Apple Podcasts. He's got a huge following online, but that's because of the vlog style that he uses. Throughout the podcast, he really makes it personal and addresses his audience as you guys. He says, "When did I talk to you guys last?" He really sticks to that vlog personal style. So it makes you feel like you're actually just hanging out with him and talking to him in a very casual, personal way. And that's the appeal of vloggers nowadays. When people are in front of a camera just telling you about their life, a lot of people really lean towards that. So Cody made his presence online and then continued it with his podcast. And there's a lot of media theory that talks about the melting power of the microphone, how it kind of makes it sound like somebody is so close to you, and that's why the microphone was so groundbreaking. So during the podcast, Cody basically, in no specific order, just goes on to talk about small little stories that happened to him while he was traveling. He talks about some stories from a plane. He talks about refusing to hold a young kid's hand when he was really stressed. He talks about being in Barcelona and not being able to find an Uber. And he talks about people and families walking downstairs and stopping in places that they shouldn't stop. There is no clear structure to this. unlike the podcast we just reviewed, The Unsolved Crime, there's no beginning, middle, end. There's no storyline. It's just wherever his mind goes. But I think that's the reason he structures it like that. I think people wouldn't like it if it was as structured. As I said, I personally didn't like how structured and scripted the first one was. I like this one because it's a lot more natural. It's all one take. There's no edits. Which is strange because that means that this podcast is its very own niche. It's its own niche humor. You have to know kind of who Cody is and why he's funny, where he came from in order to understand this. Somebody else who knows nothing about him or doesn't get his humor might not find this entertaining. It's just some 26-year-old sitting at a podcast mic rambling about nothing. But I relate to this. To me it's funny because I've been to Barcelona and I've struggled to find an Uber too because there is no Uber in Barcelona. And it was just funny the tangent he went on because I really understood that in the moment. But my mother, who's 20 years older than me, would have listened to this and not found it funny at all because she can't relate to it. So it's a very niche market to be rambling the way he is. So in terms of structure, I find the lack of structure actually gives this its entertainment value. It's not necessarily easy to listen to and understand because you don't really know where he's going, but it's so casual that you just feel comfortable listening to it. So for me, I found in terms of entertainment value, the structure or lack thereof really worked for this podcast. I found the successful appeal to emotion very funny. Just the way he talks and he emphasizes certain words and how he makes subjects that are so uninteresting and so boring and so not something that you can really talk about. He takes it and makes it so funny. And that's what I find interesting about the entertainment value of this podcast. In terms of content, like I said, the subjects discussed aren't really intriguing. They're very random and not structured at all, but he still finds a way to make them entertaining. And again, design and details. It's designed in such a way that doesn't really keep your interest, but it's so that it makes you feel like you're right there beside him talking to him. And that's why I think this podcast is entertaining. So if the Unsolved Murder Mystery podcast is an example of how to take a very, very interesting subject and keep it entertaining by adding cool details and adding a lot of layers of depth, this podcast is an example of how to take something that's not interesting at all, silly random stories that make no sense together, but make them entertaining by making you feel like you're with this guy, that you're part of his hangout crew, that you're just hanging out with him talking, and it's very casual. So I think this has a very different kind of entertainment value than the podcast I listened to before, but they both really appealed to the emotions that they were trying to appeal to. So the final podcast that I listened to was Ben Miller and the Search for Alien Life. Why are we so fascinated by the idea that we aren't alone in the universe? This is a podcast by The Guardian's Nicola Davis, Ian Chambers, and Kit Buchanan. Now, the reason I really clicked this podcast was because of the topic. I find this a very interesting topic in my free time. I watch a lot of interviews about alien life or the potential of life in the universe. It's perhaps a niche science market for this podcast. Like perhaps people who watch this podcast or listen to this podcast would have to be interested in science and the search for alien life. But I very personally think that it's an extremely interesting subject to talk about. So Ben Miller he has a PhD in physics at Cambridge, but he went into a life of comedy. He went into a career for comedy, but he is a well-known physicist with a PhD at Cambridge. So I think the most important thing when listening to this podcast is remembering the authority. So who's talking? And when I was listening to this, there was a lot of back and forth. It's basically structured as an interview. So the podcast, the people from The Guardian are interviewing Ben Miller about his thoughts on the search for life. And it's really important to understand that the person talking we want to believe and listen to, the reason we're listening to his words is because of the place of authority he holds as a scientist, as a man with a PhD from Cambridge, especially on a topic like the universe. So this actually, maybe it was the British accents. Everybody in this podcast had a British accent, but it really reminded me of the conversation we had last week in class about high culture versus low culture radio and TV, the British model versus the US model. This podcast was very informative. It was very education based. There was no obvious sponsorship. The first one, the Unsolved Murders podcast, had a commercial break right in the middle. It took up 3 minutes. This one was not sponsored. Obviously, it was probably backed by advertising, being a podcast from The Guardian. However, it just didn't feel that way. It felt very informative. And there's a lot of levels of authority with scientists. Like, this is facts that we're talking about. This is science that we're talking about. So I think that was very important to keep in mind while listening to this podcast. So as I said earlier, the structure for this was an interview, which makes sense. They were really asking Ben Miller about his book and his thoughts on the search for life beyond the universe. So there was no beginning, middle, and end the way the first podcast, The True Crime, was. And in terms of successful appeal to emotion, I'm not sure if they were really trying to invoke anything. It definitely invoked a lot of curiosity. But I just found this podcast slightly boring. I think they took a very, very interesting subject and kind of made it seem like a lecture. It definitely sounded like I was learning something rather than being entertained or laughing or being scared. So there was some sort of entertainment value to it, but I think more of the value of this podcast is what I learned and what I learned about the search for life outside of our Earth. So the content in terms of this podcast was definitely intriguing. It was definitely original. The things that they talk about were the exact reason I clicked the podcast. However, I just think it was lacking in a little bit of design and details, so that it lost my interest a little bit. There was no background music or dialogue. It wasn't there. There was no music to keep you going, but it is structured as an interview. So I guess in that sense, it was very interesting to hear what his opinion was and what he had to say. But again, I think it is a very niche podcast because it's not so much an entertaining podcast. It's more a curiosity podcast, more to learn more about life beyond our universe or life beyond our Earth. And I think it's also kind of strange because they tried to make it funny. Like, there were a couple jokes in there. One of the interviewers asked, hey, maybe aliens are into jazz just the way you are. And you kind of laugh because they're laughing, but it just wasn't intrinsically funny the way Cody was. Cody did something where he took uninteresting subjects and made them interesting. And I found this podcast took rather interesting subjects, like a subject that I really, really would like to learn about and hear about, and they made it more boring. So this podcast just felt more like a lecture than an entertaining podcast. So in terms of entertainment value, I don't think this one lived up to the two podcasts I had listened to before, but I do also think that I learned a lot from it. I listened to I definitely was critically aware of who was talking. It felt like there was an authority figure talking, a scientist. I appreciated that, and for those reasons, I think it lacked in entertainment value, but made up for it in other ways. So, in conclusion, all three of these podcasts had very different types of entertainment value. Unsolved True Crimes is intriguing and successfully kept my suspense throughout the podcast while still revealing interesting and important details of the case. The detailed use of character dramatization, sound effects, and music really contributed to the entertainment value of telling a true crime story. The structure was effective for the investigation-style podcast, however, it did seem a little bit staged and cliched. The Cody Ko podcast, Insanely Chill, was very different in that I had little to no structure, but it still maintained my interest and kept me interested in laughing throughout the podcast. I enjoy the casual vlog style podcast. It's less forced, much more natural, and much less focused on detail, but it still worked to entertain me. However, that is a subjective experience, and that might not work for everybody, and that might not be an entertaining or entertainment value for everybody. So it's a very, very niche market. And perhaps, finally, the Ben Miller podcast on the search for alien life was an interesting subject, but lacked some sort of entertainment value because it didn't really keep my interest, despite the fact that the topic they were discussing really piqued my interest and was the whole reason I clicked that podcast in the first place. Perhaps it belongs to a very niche type of podcast subject. It was very educational, and I can definitely say I walked away learning something, so it was valuable in that way, and I definitely felt like I had learned something and I was engaged in some sort of thought. However, I would not attribute this style of podcast to entertainment, but rather education. Thank you for listening. This is Alicia. Let me know your thoughts on the